Well, there's less than 2 weeks until the fabled Pokemon presents. One thing I promised myself I would look into is what really happened in the war 3,000 years ago. Who really was involved if I can put every piece of the puzzle together, from official interviews to random piece of dialogue in game? And while this takes a different turn, I hope you will leave this video saying WTF. I wasn't thinking of doing this podcast again, but I really wanted to investigate the Kalos War. And so let's start from the beginning. This is what the game tells us. The man's beloved Pokemon took part in the war. And you can see one side on the left with Rhyperior and Floette. Kalos developed some of the most impressive lore probably to date. Probably the most innovative for the Pokemon world. For how boxed in they are, especially after Black 2 and White 2 kind of failed when they tried to get more serious. They went pretty crazy, establishing this 3,000-year-old figure and trying to give a huge backstory to the Pokemon world, almost a mythological backstory. But a question that would fuel numerous headcanons over the years was, who exactly was Kalos fighting? If one side of this war is Kalos, what secretly is the other side? So, I looked through every piece of dialogue in-game, and there was no answer to this. But thankfully, I found something when looking at an interview that Masuda did in 2014. It's not going to give us too much info, but at least it gives us somewhere to start thinking from. I could not find the original Japanese for this. If Game Informer wants to release it, it'd be helpful, though I don't think this can be mistranslated really. The exact details of the war and its impact on the world of Pokemon are ambiguous. Will we ever learn more about what transpired during that war? And Masuda says, the war was a clash between two different countries. People treated Pokemon with special powers as mere tools in their conflict. They gathered lots of Pokemon and Pokemon with unique powers. This long conflict was drawn out and many lives were lost. In order to emerge victorious, the soldiers believed that they needed even more powerful Pokemon. AZ loved his Pokemon, which he had received from his late mother, but it was forcefully taken from him by the soldiers. Can we pause right there? As we'll discuss later on in this, isn't AZ the king? What king gets his Pokemon taken from the soldiers? This is why I don't have too much confidence in Game Freak at times. They're not too sure what they established. They kind of go with the flow and forget sometimes if it contradicts what they wrote earlier. I just want you to know Game Freak does this. I know soldiers did not just take the king's Floette and he had to cry in his room for years, the backstory describes, until he gets a casket back. But anyhow, it's useful information. Keep reading. Received it from his late mother, but was forcefully taken from him by the soldiers. His Pokemon ended up becoming just another sacrifice in the war. Distraught with grief, AZ began work on his machine. Little did he know that his creation would bring great sorrow to the world. Whatever you think that means. Xenia seems to imply in Emerald that world has no Kalos War in its history. So what separates the Mega Evolution timeline from the normal timeline is this war, which only brings more value to what this war was. Of course, back then, Game Freak wrote that because they're making it up as they go, and they didn't know Mega Evolution would be pushed to the sidelines, and they would just introduce more gimmicks and more lore about different countries as 3,000 years ago. But as we return to Legends ZA and Megas in the current day, maybe there is a soft spot for Mega Evolution, and it's a bit more important than the other gimmicks. The last lead I found as to who this war could be against does come in some pieces of dialogue in the familiar face of AZ's younger brother. Now this is kind of mind-blowing. There's a quote from a book on Lysander's desk that says, AZ had a younger brother. It said that he led a legion of greedy souls who wanted to seize the Kalos region. His dark intention was to make it his own. This makes it sound like the war. Even if Masuda says it was between two countries, again, give me the original script. At a glance, this would make it seem like some kind of civil war, that AZ was fighting his own brother that wanted to usurp the throne from him and lead Kalos in a better direction. Which, if this happened before the launching of the weapon, maybe AZ's brother was a better leader than AZ. I'm sure he wouldn't have made a machine and genocided. His dark intention was to make it his own. But when he saw how Kalos had been ravaged by the war, he took the weapon his brother had created and buried that weapon deep underground. Now, this book seems to span over a long period of time. The first half of him wanting to seize Kalos seems to be before the weapon was launched. And then the second half, where he doesn't want Kalos anymore, seems to be after it was launched, which still can support the idea that it really was his own younger brother that he was fighting, and this was some kind of civil war. I looked at it in Japanese, and there are some discrepancies, but it's not too important. Like highlighted in orange, ubau tameni, which means to take by force, but it doesn't mention anywhere that he was greedy and had some malicious intent. All of that seems fabricated when they translate it to English. It could have been his brother was a more fit leader who was trying to lead Kalos in a better direction. Anyhow, even if it was his younger brother that's on the other side of that war, it doesn't disprove the fun we're about to have in this video. So, one of the most interesting theories since Scarlet Novella came out is that the war was against Paldea. You all know this theory, and I'm sure Game Freak well intended us to think of this theory when they suddenly introduced a region right beside Kalos with a giant hole in it. Even if they give us an explanation like a crater landed there, they know exactly what they're doing. This is even more overt than the region being shaped like a turtle. But let's not talk about turtle theory. There's plenty of podcasts for this later. About Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, but let's simplify it to Spain for this video. Spain and France have fought each other plenty of times over the last 800 years. And some of the most prominent of these wars is the Franco-Spanish War, fought between France and Spain, which ended with the Sun King marrying a Spanish princess, a political marriage to shut it up, but a war technically won by France, gaining them these new territories, as well as the War of Spanish Succession. This one is a huge war, which started with the King of Spain dying with no children. Some say because he's too inbred. Don't look at me. But since there was no one to take the throne, while he was on his deathbed, he named his successor as Philip of Anjou. I'm probably saying that wrong. Who is the grandson of the legendary Sun King of France. So the Spanish king is gonna die, and he names a French king's grandson to take the throne. This pissed off the rest of Europe, who were like, you're about to unite France and Spain together. And it caused this grand alliance to form with several countries who wanted a king from Austria to be planted there instead. They were too terrified of the European balance being disrupted. This grand alliance is pretty cool. And this is why I wanted to bring up this war. It consists of, if you look at the red, Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, Savoy, Prussia, Hanover, if I'm saying all those right. They wanted to fight to install, well, I said king, but he's actually a little boy at this time. They wanted him to take the throne so we could separate France from Spain. So they worked so hard to fight this war against the blue, which was, of course, you can see there. And that's why I brought up the Iberian Peninsula a bit, because Portugal was on the other side during this, but simplified to France and Spain, who had a lot more territory back then with Naples and Bavaria. As you can see, that is quite a giant war. You could almost say it's like a world war, even though it really just took place in this European part of the world. But that is huge. The war ultimately ended with the grandson of the Sun King getting the throne, but under the condition that he renounce the French throne, and also that France and Spain never unite under one crown. This was the treaty signed, and then everyone went their separate ways. What was important is that these nations all remain balanced to some extent. If any nation starts to get too powerful, the other nations will ally against them. Earlier in the history, you had Spain as a part of a grand alliance against France. So it's no exact legion to each other. Everyone needs to keep each other in check, which is why I wanted to bring it up. A suspiciously interesting backstory, huh, Game Freak? Anyhow, back to Pokemon. Now, if we were to say that it really is Paldea and Kalos fighting, and AZ launched the ultimate weapon, which would imply AZ was in Paldea around the Great Crater at that time, and destroyed all the battlefield, leaving the mark of Area Zero, it would have to imply Area Zero is 3,000 years old. But the game well documents that Area Zero is not 3,000 years old. It dates back to 1,000,000 years ago. Or if you get further in the game, they even go as far as to say 2,000,000 years ago. So unless the crater's age is emphasized here, this theory can't work, that this is the product of the ultimate weapon, which, staring at it now, how crazy if Game Freak hid this right under our nose. Or didn't even hide it. But there's some games to play with this. Check as I put some dates in front of you. If I were to ask you the earliest point in Paldea's recorded history, how far back do you think it goes? It goes back to 2,000 years ago, when a Paldean empire forms. You learn this pretty early in the game when you take Rhyfort's classes. The Paldean Empire began to rule this region approximately 2,000 years ago. They were so strong with resources that they decided to usher in the great age of piracy and sent goons down to find the One Piece in the crater. And they did this for the next 1,000 years, which meant that the descendants of this Paldean king would continue to do this again and again. But they were sacrificing the stability of their kingdom as they did it. And 1,000 years later, which puts us at 1,000 years ago today, the empire fell. Then, 200 years later, Uva or Naranja Academy is formed. And that leads to contemporary Paldea, which we have a much better recorded history of. Probably all the books in Uva and Naranja describe well the last 800 years, but not too well the stuff that came before that. Now, do you notice the fun Game Freak had with these dates? It is no coincidence. 2,000 years ago, the Paldean Empire forms. 800 years ago, our academy forms. They did all this within the circle of 3,000 years. It allows me to make an interesting case here. See, if AZ did launch the weapon in Paldea, and Area Zero was ground zero for the attack, that means Paldea, as we knew it 3,000 years ago, was wiped out. And there is no transfer of history. Then, a whole 1,000 years later, we get our first Paldean history with an empire rising. The dates Game Freak chose to use secretly allow a history like this to be possible. Snarky on their end to do that. It must have been intentional. But something like this requires us to take too much liberty, because as I said earlier, the crater has its own documented timeline. It's 1,000,000 years old. And even though, as I showed with that interview, Game Freak is willing to retcon as they move things along, something like this is too big to retcon. And our main purpose of this video is not what they can turn Area Zero into by revealing 10 years from now, oh, it really is AZ's weapon that caused it. I want to know what Area Zero is right now. When they made Paldea, this giant turtle-looking region with a hole, did they intend at all that this could be where AZ's weapon landed? Because that's the real truth. And so, to bridge the gap and try to make use of all the information we have, I'm going to put forward a theory here. What if both are correct? Why say Pteropagus's history is inaccurate, that it got lost in seismic activity deep under Area Zero, or that the dating for the crater is inaccurate when they say it's 1,000,000 years ago? What if the crater really was formed by some meteor that struck Paldea 1,000,000 years ago? We have to talk about what this meteor really is, because at the bottom of Area Zero, you find Pteropagus. So this could imply a similar history as Necrozma and Eternatus, that Pteropagus, I know it's not too creative on Pokemon Zen, but they started it, that Pteropagus was in the meteor when it fell, and it's some kind of godly Pokemon, well, godly to us, that crashed into Paldea and started something. You see, because if Pteropagus is the Pokemon that it is today, this meteor would have been something more like, not the Pteropagus you find deep in Area Zero. It would have been something like a Mother Pteropagus, or a Stellar Pteropagus. Stellar Tropigus, of course, is the concept of turtles all the way down, and the third turtle is a giant Pteropagus. If you look at some of the Pokedex entries, they even describe it as something moving through space. So you combine this philosophical idea about Pteropagus carrying the Earth on its back with the actual material idea that there was a giant stellar Pteropagus floating through space that crashed into Paldea 1,000,000 years ago, creating the Great Crater. And what this would have done is created giant beaming crystals out of Area Zero. There would have been many Pteropagus that landed on Earth that day in the crater. It might have even at the moment blessed the entire Paldea to where these terrestrial spots were beaming all over. But it was 1,000,000 years ago, and it eventually dies down to where it's only in the crater that you see this picture with the fog. It wouldn't have looked like this. What you see at the bottom with those giant crystals, they would be beaming all the way to the top here, so that any civilization from 1,000,000 years ago to, let's say, 3 to 5,000 years ago would think of it as some godly crater. They would share rumors that there's some god that lives underneath it, describe to the rest of the world how beautiful and glimmering it is, but they wouldn't be able to do much about it. It would just be a crater filled with shooting crystals. And maybe people who live around the crater are blessed for reasons they don't know. Because, as you can see with the tree that's in Area Zero, the terrestrial energy, you can feed off it and live. It is filled with life energy. Not to confuse it with AZ firing a weapon of life energy. Really, let's not confuse it, because I'm trying to combine all the information Game Freak gave us. But you see, what I described creates a situation where people would live specifically alongside the crater. So when we get to 3,000 years ago in Paldea, where more advanced people start to show up and they realize they can make use of these crystals and they start to create technology, as you see in the scripts for the Pokemon game, if you look at the files, the Great Crater of Paldea is referred to as Atlantis. And if you look deep in the crater, you see some tablet with indestructible technology, clearly something we're disconnected from, and something the Paldean Empire 2,000 years ago didn't use. What I'm trying to say is, the Paldea that AZ fought could have been the equivalent of the Atlanteans, who were so technologically advanced because they were the first civilization living around the crater that actually did something with the crystals and scientifically enhanced everything. Back in this Atlantean day where the terrestrial energy was overflowing much more, there was probably a further evolution to Glamora and all sorts of different variants. Just as you have Exeggutor growing differently in the sun, you would have had all sorts of different Pokemon evolving differently because of this overflowing power. These Atlanteans would have been the first ones to discover the existence of Pteropaguses, and plural, with the main city of Atlantis being the main hub of this terrestrial energy itself, placed where? But on top of the crater, being the capital of this pre-ancient Paldea, this Atlantean Paldea. And this is the setting that AZ fired the weapon, which means, under my explanation, that AZ firing this weapon didn't create this entire situation. It did not create the entire crater. All it did was destroy the main capital, destroy Atlantis, destroy everything, and reset it to zero, to where people don't even know Pteropagus exists anymore. And thus, the majority of the depths of the crater are preserved and accurate to say this is a time capsule of how things were in the ancient past, so that you can find the version of Area Zero you find today, where all the beaming crystals are gone and only a couple at the very bottom coming from just the one last surviving Pteropagus. That's interesting, right? This makes use of every bit of lore they gave us. Though there are some weirdnesses that Game Freak started. Like, for example, here's what a crater actually looks like. No meteor or celestial body that hits a planet is going to leave that deep of a hole. unless the planet is made of jello. Though I've worked it out in my head, and an explanation I can give is that it's because it's terropagus. It's because it's coated in this terrestrial energy that it could pierce the earth and go deep enough to form this giant hole. If you think about it any other way, it's a comedy on Game Freak's end. And don't get me started on making fun of them more. I mean, look at this crater. How the heck otherwise can it go so deep? So there's your answer for you, Game Freak. If that wasn't your answer to start with, feel free to turn it into the answer. Steal it. But yeah, this is why as you go deeper into the crater, you would find stuff like this tablet, which I don't know why they used to block the cave that has the grassy symbol, but clearly the ancient Paldeans, which I'll just call, for the sake of this video, the Atlantean Paldeans. I guess just Atlanteans. I guess it was a war between Kalos and Atlantis. Anyhow, it was remnants that the Atlanteans were hiding. Of course, the actual dating of Atlantis is not 3,000 years ago in our world, but it's the code name, so that's not me making that up. This is the inspiration for Area Zero. Something along the lines of what I said has to be what they intended. They just didn't go pretty deep in the games. The reason for that is Game Freak has entered this era where they'll save the lore. They intentionally didn't give us all the answers of Heat or the definitive answer of where the Paradox Pokemon are from, etc. because they want that for part 2 of Paldea, when down the line they make some modern day Pokemon game in Paldea. As for the location of the ultimate weapon, AZ clearly moved it to Geosench. The game describes you being able to hear the cries of the souls of Pokemon, which to me makes it sound like this is where AZ, after creating the ultimate weapon, this is where he sucked the souls of a bunch of Pokemon to turn it into a life-granting machine. And so when hiding the weapon much later, filled with sorrow of course, what location would he choose but to return the weapon to the graves of the souls that he took to make it work? It is interesting to note, and I don't think Game Freak meant this part to be deep, that the hole that forms when you use the ultimate weapon is a lot like Area Zero's hole, where there's just a small mountainous wall by comparison, but a very deep hole. If this was a crater, you'd be able to see the bottom of it. But I think that's just Game Freak's early use of 3D models and all. That's just how they wanted to make it look. Let's not think too deep about that. Now for something snarky. If you noticed, the war that I brought up as inspiration for what could be happening was the War of Spanish Succession, which you might have noticed is not Spain fighting France. They're on the same side. And why I use this war as the example is to show an oddity in what Game Freak has been doing, has been setting up ever since 2013. You see, in this war, you have all these European countries fighting each other to make sure they're all balanced and none of them gains too much power. And they always fight each other to do this. What I notice odd on Game Freak's end is that when they make Kalos in France and they take their break year for the anniversary in Alola, rather than going to India, Australia, Mew's homeland in Guyana, there are places Game Freak can explore if they want to world build Pokemon, various different parts of the world. But instead, they go back to Europe. Not just Europe, but they go straight to a neighboring place to Kalos. They go to Galar, right north of Kalos. Then they go to Spain, connected to Kalos. It is not an accident. Look at the countries I just named. They're all filled with their own lore and beauty, but they stick to this small section of Europe, which gives me the feeling that what Game Freak really wanted to do was taking inspiration from the way these European countries fight each other. They wanted to establish that the war 3,000 years ago was between all of the European countries. They just didn't have a name as regions back then. What Game Freak would have been planning, again, this is entirely just what I'm thinking, but what Game Freak would have wanted to do was spoon feed us just a bit of lore of what happened 3,000 years ago. Then over the course of the next games, introduce all these European regions and expand what AZ started, which means early in their notes, when talking about the Galar region and Zacian and Zamzentinal, they would have wanted to expand and show that Galar was a part of this war. Then when making the Paldean games, they would have shown that Paldea was a part of this war, and so on. It just so happens Game Freak keeps getting cold feet when going too deep about their lore. Like if you think with Galar, the Zacian and Zamazenta story did not go too deep. But you'll notice the time period 3,000 years ago being quite important and overall popping up again and again. The darkest day happens 3,000 years ago, suspiciously. Paldea's history is missing from 3,000 years ago. Maybe even America was a part of this war, because you can see Zekrom and Reshiram erected in the Parfum Palace. And if you look at where Zekrom and Reshiram are from, they're from 2,500 years ago, when the relic castle is made by the twin heroes, which maybe the original dragon was a part of the war 3,000 years ago and goes on to be split 500 years later. As we saw in the Terra leak, Game Freak did have some kind of creationist vision for the Pokemon world, where the setting is made over millions of years, but the actual story that unfolds involving humans and modern day Pokemon maybe only spans, 3 to 5,000 years, with a major event happening ubiquitously involving all the regions 3,000 years ago. As we see in the beta for Pokemon X and Y, the war actually depicts Giratina in it as well, almost like Game Freak wanted to leave a loose end when showing AZ's backstory, the same loose end they would continue to answer and reveal more about over the course of each other game, when constantly lurking and hovering around this 3,000-year-old time period. To go with this creationist vision, it would have been something like 3,000 years ago, every nation and region was living alongside their respective legendary Pokemon, mirroring how, for us, there are depictions of humans living alongside gods thousands of years ago, almost as an eerie era lost to us, that everyone wonders what really happened 3,000 years ago. Were there really these mystical creatures and all? It's that same eeriness Game Freak wanted to capture in this. This means after Arceus made the world and all these legendaries, that they naturally fizzled out into being alongside a certain region. So after Arceus makes the lands and waters via Kyogre and Groudon for people, they settle in Hoenn and are Hoenn's respective guardians. So Hoenn has Kyogre and Groudon, Unova had Zekrom and Reshiram. Every region had their respective guardians, and 3,000 years ago was when this giant war happens that splits all the legendary Pokemon away from the region into this dormant sleeping form, to where we get a very disconnected modern day. I even ran into this line when looking at some of the books. Here it is in Japanese. It says, Sanzen nen mai ni, 3,000 years ago, in Kalos one day, a mysterious Pokemon appeared. It says that this Pokemon's name was Xerneas, and it helped people. This is not on the forefront of what Game Freak made us think the war was about. You don't see no Xerneas in that depiction 3,000 years ago. But this is in a book in X and Y right now. There's the 3,000-year mark mentioned again. Yveltal has the same history written about it as well, that 3,000 years ago, it appeared and took the souls of many, and people feared it. This sounds like Xerneas and Yveltal being on Kalos' side of the war, Xerneas helping the wounded, and Yveltal fighting the Pokemon, taking souls. An active part, actively helping Kalos in this part of the war. They were all good legendary Pokemon to their region. And funny enough, this 3,000-year mark, in Game Freak's mindset, Xerneas, Yveltal, and Giratina would have been on the battlefield at the same time, wherever their mind was during this beta. This makes all these various legendary Pokemon established for each region not look like just forces of nature, but a region's forces of nature. Now, I'm digressing, but I wanted to make this video to show you the potential of what really could be going on. And even if the interview says, Masuda wants to say it's two countries fighting each other, well, their actions are revealing something much different. There are way too many different countries for you to make your games based off, rather than you sticking in the exact same part of the world and developing Kalos' surrounding nations. The 30th anniversary is coming up, and if they wanted to do something homage-like, they would finally go to Guyana and expand Miyu's lore, make a whole region Gen 10, but it's not just Guyana. There's Peru, the Philippines, there's so many places in the world, but they stick to this one region. It's because the AZ War was against a bunch of regions, and it was to show a time period of many legendary Pokemon all living in regions alongside them. Not like humans sipping tea, right? It's not like Kyogre was sipping tea with the humans, but they were to some extent passive and loyal to various regions, which is why in the modern day, you happen to find these legendary Pokemon in these regions. You wake up Kyogre and Groudon from the Cave of Origin. Rayquaza is where in the world, but on Sky Pillar. Dialga and Palkia lurk where in the world, but in Sinnoh also. About this creationist idea, this is digressing a bit, but there's no way the Pokemon that rules time and space, that's existed for 13 billion years, is pulled out by Cyrus. The actual rulers to time, space, and all, there aren't such a thing. Game Freak is going to get there eventually, but it's all Arceus. All Dialga and Palkia really are Pokemon that can mess with it. They aren't the rulers of it. And so even something as deadly as that could have just been on Sinnoh's side in the war. In this time period, it would have involved the Celestica people, the people who would have actually known the real Arceus. It expands it to a whole different level. Anyhow, to end this video, there's one last thing I saw when looking through Pokemon X and Y, which is this line right here. It's on a bookshelf. It says that even a rich and prosperous Kalos is constantly targeted, and that the king just cannot escape war, that even his beloved Floette was taken and used in the battle. And such was the nastiness and ferocity of this conflict. So first off, remember I asked the question, when was AZ king? I got my answer. Somehow I really was right to nitpick that use of mo in the Japanese. It really was emphasis and shock that even the king had to send his own Floette into battle. But the real juice in this is the mentioning of how Kalos just cannot escape conflicts, and just how ugly this supposed war got. To imagine this is a war that happened pretty much across the whole world, taking inspiration from how the European countries always fight each other for balance. To imagine this is a war so grand that it ended completely the era of all these regions having their own legendary Pokemon, and was the war that caused them to be buried underground, to where a new history begins for all these regions, is kind of crazy. Anyhow, that's just all a theory, as Matt Pat would say. I don't have any time for Ask Tars, but don't think about the surface level of Pokemon that you can see. When Game Freak makes these games, they function on the level underneath that. And that's where you want to look. Even if you were to combine AZ's brother into the picture, you absolutely can. Because with these kings, and as you'll see in history, it's all family. Like I said earlier, it was the grandson of the Sun King that was gonna take the Spanish throne, and did take the Spanish throne, leaving behind his French. So in the same way, whoever or whatever royalty AZ belonged to fully allows for his own blood younger brother to be the king of an entirely different nation warring against him. For all you know, we wait 5-6 years and the identity of the old Galar king from 3,000 years ago is revealed, or the old Paldean king from back then is revealed, and it's just AZ's younger brother. And it's the same business going on today that was back then, which is just royalty fighting each other to ultimately conquer all the lands. Infinitely. Infinite wars just again and again. Anyhow, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I hope I left you with some WTF moment. If I did, shank that like button, and I'll see you on another podcast. Take care.